Have you ever looked at a child, a teenager, a partner, or even an adult son or daughter with ADHD and thought, why does everything have to be about them? They interrupt. They react. They forget what they promised. They say something hurtful in the heat of the moment. They miss the emotional impact they are having on everyone else. They become defensive when corrected. They seem allergic to accountability. And from the outside, it can start to look like selfishness, entitlement, or even narcissism. But here's where parents and families can get into dangerous territory. ADHD can look self-centered when the brain is actually dysregulated. Narcissism can look confident when the person is actually protecting a fragile self-image. And when those two patterns live inside the same family system, everybody can start misreading everybody. Today, we are going deep into one of the most misunderstood family dynamics I see. What happens when ADHD and narcissistic traits collide in the same home? We are going to talk about executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, rejection sensitivity, shame, narcissistic injury, empathy, remorse, repair, triangulation, overfunctioning, underfunctioning, and how one parent's interpretation of the child can either protect the child's identity or accidentally injure it. Because the goal is not to slap a label on the loudest person in the room. The goal is to understand the mechanism underneath the behavior. And once you understand the mechanism, you stop asking, what is wrong with this child? And you start asking the much better question, what is happening in this nervous system? And what is happening in this family system? That is where the healing begins. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, parenting strategist, family systems coach, ADHD specialist, and someone who looks at behavior through the full ecosystem of the family. I specialize in helping parents understand ADHD, executive functioning, emotional regulation, family roles, nervous system patterns, and the relational dynamics that keep families stuck in the same exhausting loops. I am also a mother to a now thriving neurodivergent 23-year-old son, and I have been married for over 3 decades. So when I talk about ADHD, family systems, routines, structure, emotional regulation, and what it feels like to parent a child whose brain does not always move in a straight line, I am not speaking from theory alone. I understand what it feels like when a child can be brilliant in one area and completely stuck in another. I understand what it feels like when motivation appears and disappears like it has its own Wi-Fi signal. I understand what it feels like when a child's behavior is misunderstood by other people who only see the outside presentation and not the neurological struggle underneath. And today's episode matters because this is a topic that does not get talked about enough. Families can spend years caught between two confusing realities. On one hand, they may have a child, adolescent, young adult, partner, or parent with ADHD who is impulsive, emotionally intense, easily frustrated, inconsistent, forgetful, reactive, and genuinely struggling to regulate their behavior. On the other hand, there may be someone in the family system with narcissistic traits who interprets that ADHD-driven behavior as disrespect, defiance, selfishness, or a personal attack. And that combination can become extremely explosive because an ADHD nervous system needs co-regulation, structure, warmth, repetition, predictability, and repair. A person with narcissistic traits often responds to dysregulation with criticism, shame, control, withdrawal, blame, or emotional reversal. So the ADHD child escalates. The narcissistic parent feels injured or disrespected. The parent responds with more intensity. The child becomes more dysregulated. The other parent tries to step in, and suddenly the whole family is in a triangle. Nobody is regulating. Everybody is reacting. And the child often becomes the identified problem. That phrase matters, the identified problem. In family systems work, the identified problem is the person everyone points to as the issue, even though the real issue is often the entire relational pattern. In many homes, The child with ADHD becomes the identified problem because their symptoms are the most visible. They are the one yelling, forgetting, interrupting, melting down, refusing, storming off, or saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. But visibility is not the same as causality. Sometimes the most obvious symptom is only the place where the family system is leaking. So today, I want to teach this with depth, precision, and compassion. We are going to separate ADHD from narcissism. We are going to look at where they can appear similar. We are going to define the psychological terms clearly. We are going to explore what happens when a narcissistic parent misreads an ADHD child. And we are going to talk about what the healthier parent can do to protect the child's self-concept, stabilize the family system, and stop the cycle from becoming the child's identity. Let us start with the confusion, because this is where so many parents get stuck. ADHD can sometimes look narcissistic from the outside. That does not mean it is narcissism. It means the behavior can overlap on the surface while the internal mechanism is completely different. A teenager with ADHD may interrupt constantly. They may talk over people. They may forget birthdays, chores, texts, plans, assignments, and promises. They may dominate a conversation because their brain is moving quickly and they are trying to get the thought out before it disappears. They may become emotionally explosive when corrected. They may seem unable to tolerate frustration. They may say, I know, stop telling me, even though they clearly do not know, because the shame of being corrected feels unbearable in that moment. From the outside, a parent may think they only care about themselves, but internally, something very different may be happening. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition, which means it is rooted in how the brain develops and functions. It is not a moral failure, a character defect, or a lack of love for the family. ADHD affects the brain's ability to regulate attention, emotion, motivation, working memory, inhibition, time awareness, and task initiation. The term executive function is essential here. Executive functions are the brain-based skills that allow a person to plan, organize, start tasks, manage time, control impulses, regulate emotions, remember instructions, shift flexibly, and use past experience to guide future behavior. I often describe executive function as the brain's management system. It is the internal CEO that helps organize everything else. In ADHD, that CEO is not absent, but it is inconsistent. Sometimes it shows up beautifully. Other times, it is apparently on a lunch break with no calendar invite. And this is why ADHD can be so confusing to families. The child can hyperfocus on music, video games, sports statistics, cars, fashion, makeup, TikTok edits, guitar riffs, surfing, football, or building something complicated, but then cannot start a basic homework assignment or remember to bring the dishes upstairs. That inconsistency makes parents think, you can do it when you care. But ADHD is not simply about caring. It is about neurological activation. The ADHD brain engages more easily when something is interesting, urgent, novel, emotionally meaningful, competitive, or immediately rewarding. It struggles when something is boring, delayed, repetitive, unclear, or emotionally loaded with shame. Now compare that with narcissism. Narcissism, when we are talking about clinically meaningful traits, involves entitlement, a need for admiration, difficulty with accountability, sensitivity to criticism, lack of consistent empathy, image protection, and a tendency to devalue others when the self feels threatened. Narcissism is not primarily a problem of attention regulation. It is a problem of self-structure, shame defense, empathy, entitlement, and relational control. This distinction matters because an ADHD child may appear self-centered because they are dysregulated, overloaded, impulsive, or developmentally delayed in executive functioning. A narcissistic person appears self-centered because preserving their image, control, superiority, or emotional dominance becomes more important than mutuality. Same-looking behavior, different root system. One is a regulation problem. The other is often an empathy and accountability problem. That is not a small difference. That difference determines how we parent, how we intervene, how we protect the child, and how we understand the family system. Let us make this very practical. Imagine a 15-year-old boy with ADHD. His mother asks him to take out the trash. He says, "I will do it in a minute." 20 minutes pass. He forgets. His mother reminds him. He snaps, "Oh my gosh, stop nagging me. I said I would do it." He rolls his eyes, storms into the kitchen, grabs the trash bag, and mutters something disrespectful under his breath. Now, from the outside, that looks rude. It is rude. We do not need to pretend it is fine, but clinically, we want to ask, what is driving this? In ADHD, that reaction may be driven by a combination of executive dysfunction, shame, emotional impulsivity, and low frustration tolerance. Emotional impulsivity means the feeling comes out before the brain has had time to filter it. The child is not carefully constructing a plan to humiliate the parent. The child is flooded. The feeling gets a microphone before the prefrontal cortex has reviewed the script. Low frustration tolerance means the nervous system has limited capacity to tolerate obstacles, delays, corrections, or demands without escalating. A child with ADHD may experience ordinary reminders as disproportionately irritating because their brain is already working harder to manage transitions, demands, internal noise, and shame. Now imagine a different pattern. A teenager is asked to take out the trash. He says, "That is not my job. Why should I have to do everything?" He watches everyone else work, refuses repeatedly, and when confronted, he smirks and says, "You are crazy. I never said I would do it. You always make things up." Later, when a sibling complains, he says, "Mom only cares because she is controlling. She is the problem, not me." That is a different flavor. Now we are seeing possible entitlement, reality distortion, blame shifting, lack of remorse, and triangulation. That does not automatically diagnose narcissism, especially in teenagers, because adolescents are still developing. But it tells us we are looking at more than simple ADHD forgetfulness. One of the strongest differentiators is remorse and repair. A child with ADHD may say something awful in the moment and then feel genuinely guilty afterward. Once the nervous system settles and the prefrontal cortex comes back online, they may say, "I am sorry. I should not have said that." They may struggle to repair perfectly. They may still need coaching. But there is often a visible return of empathy. With narcissistic behavior, the apology is often absent, conditional, performative, or weaponized. The person may say, "I am sorry you feel that way," which is not an apology. That is emotional fog wearing a cardigan. They may say, "Fine, I am sorry, but you made me do it." Or they may apologize only when there is something to gain, then repeat the same behavior without meaningful change. The key question is not simply, did they say sorry? The deeper question is there genuine ownership, empathy for the impact, and willingness to change the pattern? That is where the clinical difference begins to show. Here is where things get even more nuanced. ADHD often comes with something called rejection sensitivity or rejection sensitive dysphoria, sometimes called RSD. Rejection sensitivity means the person experiences perceived criticism, disappointment, exclusion, or failure with intense emotional pain. Dysphoria means an intensely uncomfortable emotional state. So rejection-sensitive dysphoria refers to the intense emotional flooding that can happen when someone with ADHD feels rejected, corrected, criticized, embarrassed, or like they have disappointed someone. A child with ADHD may hear, "Please clean your room," and emotionally experience it as, "You are a failure." They may hear, "You forgot again," and feel immediate shame. They may hear, "You interrupted me," and feel exposed, embarrassed, and attacked. Their reaction may seem too big for the situation because internally, their nervous system is not responding only to the words. It is responding to years of feeling behind, corrected, misunderstood, criticized, or not enough. Now compare that with narcissistic injury. Narcissistic injury happens when a person with narcissistic traits experiences something as a wound to their self-image, superiority, control, or status. The injury may be triggered by criticism, boundaries, not being admired, not being obeyed, being exposed, being questioned, or not being centered. The person may respond with rage, withdrawal, contempt, blame, victimhood, or devaluation. These two patterns can look similar because both involve intense reactions to perceived criticism. But again, the mechanism is different. The ADHD child feels shame because they already feel inadequate. The narcissistic person feels injured because their self-image is being challenged. The ADHD child often thinks, "I am bad." The narcissistic person often thinks, "How dare you make me feel bad?" That distinction is everything. A child with ADHD who has rejection sensitivity needs help separating correction from condemnation. They need to learn, a reminder is not an attack. A mistake is not an identity. Accountability does not mean I am unlovable. That child needs co-regulation, emotional language, and skill building. A person responding from narcissistic injury usually needs firm boundaries and accountability. They may not be helped by endless reassurance because the issue is not merely insecurity. The issue is their inability or unwillingness to tolerate another person's separate reality. In the family system, these two patterns can collide violently. The ADHD child feels ashamed and reacts defensively. The narcissistic parent feels disrespected and reacts punitively. The child escalates. The parent escalates. Then the child gets labeled as the problem because their behavior is louder, messier, and easier to point to. But the loudest nervous system is not always the most powerful one. A child with ADHD needs a parent who can interpret their behavior accurately. That does not mean excusing everything. It means understanding the difference between won't and can't yet, between defiance and dysregulation, between lack of empathy and delayed emotional processing. When a parent with narcissistic traits misreads ADHD behavior, they often interpret the child's symptoms through a personal lens. The child's forgetfulness becomes disrespect. The child's impulsivity becomes intentional humiliation. The child's emotional outburst becomes evidence that the child is bad, ungrateful, selfish, or out of control. The child's need for support becomes an inconvenience. The child's struggle becomes an insult to the parent's image. This creates a toxic feedback loop. The ADHD child is already struggling with internal regulation. The narcissistic parent adds shame. Shame increases dysregulation. Dysregulation creates more symptoms. More symptoms trigger more criticism. More criticism deepens the child's negative identity. This is how a child begins to internalize labels. They hear, "You are selfish." They hear, "You only care about yourself." They hear, "You always ruin everything." They hear, "You are impossible." They hear, "You just want attention." They hear, "You are manipulating everyone." And over time, those statements become part of the child's self-concept. Self-concept means the internal story a person develops about who they are. For a child with ADHD, self-concept is already vulnerable because they often receive more correction than other children. They may be told to sit still, stop talking, hurry up, calm down, pay attention, stop forgetting, stop interrupting, stop losing things, stop being dramatic, stop being difficult. Even when parents are loving, The ratio of correction can become very high. Now add a narcissistic parent who interprets these behaviors as character flaws. The child does not simply learn, I have ADHD. The child learns, I am bad. That is an entirely different developmental outcome. This is why accurate interpretation is protective. When you say to a child, your brain struggles with transitions, so we are going to build a system, you are protecting identity. When you say, you are not lazy, your task initiation system needs support, you are protecting identity. When you say, you are responsible for repair, but you are not a bad person because you became dysregulated, you are protecting identity. That does not mean lowering expectations. It means attaching expectations to skill building instead of shame. And let me say this clearly. Shame is not a strategy. Shame may produce short-term compliance, but it does not build executive function. It does not build emotional regulation. It does not build secure attachment. It does not build self-trust. Shame may get the trash taken out tonight, but it may cost the child their sense of worth over time. And over time, that becomes too expensive. From a Bowen family systems perspective, this family dynamic often becomes a triangle. A triangle is a three-person emotional pattern that forms when tension between two people becomes too intense and a third person gets pulled in to stabilize the anxiety. In a family with ADHD and narcissistic traits, the triangle may look like this. The ADHD child becomes dysregulated. The narcissistic parent becomes critical, shaming, or controlling. The other parent steps in to protect or explain the child. The narcissistic parent accuses the other parent of undermining them. The child feels guilty or responsible. The other parent becomes the emotional buffer. The narcissistic parent feels excluded or disrespected. The child escalates again. Now the family is not solving the original issue. The family is organizing itself around emotional reactivity. The non-narcissistic parent often becomes the overfunctioner. Overfunctioning means taking on excessive responsibility for the emotional or practical functioning of others. This parent may become the translator, mediator, protector, scheduler, emotional coach, apology manager, routine builder, and crisis preventer. They may try to explain ADHD to the narcissistic parent over and over. They may try to soften the child's behavior so the other parent does not explode. They may try to prevent conflict by anticipating everyone's mood. The problem is that overfunctioning can become exhausting and unsustainable. It may reduce immediate explosions, but it can accidentally reinforce the system. The narcissistic parent does not have to develop emotional accountability because someone else keeps cleaning up the relational mess. The ADHD child may not develop enough skill because the overfunctioning parent is constantly rescuing. The overfunctioning parent becomes resentful, depleted, and hypervigilant. Meanwhile, the ADHD child may become the identified patient. In family systems language, the identified patient is the family member whose symptoms are treated as the main problem, even though those symptoms may reflect stress in the larger system. This does not mean the child does not have ADHD. The ADHD is real, but the child's symptoms may be amplified by the emotional climate of the family. For example, a child with ADHD may have moderate difficulty with homework in a calm home. In a tense home where every missing assignment turns into shame, yelling, blame, or marital conflict, that same homework issue can become a nightly crisis. The child's executive dysfunction is now fused with family anxiety. This is why we cannot look at ADHD symptoms in isolation. The ecosystem matters. Sleep matters. Screen time matters. Nutrition matters. Structure matters. Parental regulation matters. Co-parenting matters. The emotional tone of the home matters. The family hierarchy matters. The child's role in the system matters. ADHD is neurological, but it does not live in a vacuum. It lives in a family. Let us step inside the child's experience for a moment. A child with ADHD often lives with a nervous system that feels inconsistent even to them. They may wake up wanting to do better. They may genuinely intend to remember, follow through, stay calm, finish the assignment, be kinder to their sibling, or avoid the argument. But then the moment arrives and their brain does not cooperate. They forget what they meant to remember, even when the intention was real. They react before they have had time to think, because the emotional part of the brain often moves faster than the reflective part of the brain. They procrastinate, not always because they are lazy or careless, but because task initiation can feel neurologically heavy when the brain does not have enough interest, urgency, structure, or dopamine to begin. They interrupt because the thought feels immediate and important, and if they do not say it right now, it may feel like it will disappear. They lose track of time because ADHD often disrupts time awareness, making 10 minutes feel like 2 minutes and a deadline feel far away until it is suddenly on fire. They say the thing they should not say, the sharp comment, the defensive comeback, the emotionally loaded sentence that comes out before wisdom has a chance to put shoes on. They avoid the task because the task may carry shame, boredom, overwhelm, uncertainty, or the memory of past failure. They melt down because their nervous system has exceeded its capacity to stay organized. And then afterward, when the storm passes and the prefrontal cortex comes back online, they often feel shame. They replay what they said. They remember the look on your face. They feel the disappointment in the room. They may not show it right away because shame often hides behind defensiveness, humor, avoidance, irritability, or I don't care. But underneath that reaction is often a child, teen, partner, or young adult thinking, why did I do that again? Why can't I just get it together? Why do I keep hurting the people I love? That is why ADHD requires more than correction. It requires skill building, structure, emotional repair, and language that separates the person's worth from the behavior that needs to change. Now imagine that child is living with a parent who does not understand ADHD and instead responds with contempt, criticism, or humiliation. Contempt is a relational stance of superiority. It says, I am above you and you are beneath me. Contempt can show up through eye-rolling, mocking, sarcasm, name-calling, disgusted facial expressions, or comments like, what is wrong with you? Contempt is extremely damaging in family relationships because it attacks the person's dignity rather than addressing the behavior. A child can recover from correction. A child can recover from limits. A child can recover from consequences. But contempt is different. Contempt says, your struggle makes you less worthy of respect. When a child with ADHD receives contempt from a parent, they may begin to develop toxic shame. Toxic shame is not the healthy guilt that says, I did something wrong. Toxic shame says, I am wrong. It becomes identity-level pain. The child stops thinking, I need to build better homework systems, and starts thinking, I am lazy. They stop thinking, I need help regulating anger, and start thinking, I am a bad person. They stop thinking, my brain needs support, and start thinking, I ruin everything. This is where secondary anxiety and depression can develop. Many ADHD kids do not become anxious or depressed simply because they have ADHD. They become anxious or depressed because of the repeated experience of failure, criticism, misunderstanding, and relational rupture. That is why the family response matters so much. A child with ADHD needs adults who can say, you are responsible for your behavior, and you are still worthy of love. Both parts matter. If we only say, you are worthy of love, but never teach responsibility, the child does not build skills. If we only say, you are responsible, but communicate it through shame, the child may build compliance while losing self-worth. Healthy parenting holds both, accountability and attachment. Here is a deeper layer. Sometimes ADHD kids do begin to look more narcissistic over time because they develop defensive patterns to protect themselves from shame. This is not the same as having narcissistic personality structure, but it can mimic it. A child who feels constantly criticized may start acting like they do not care. They may say, "Whatever, this is stupid." They may blame everyone else. They may refuse to apologize. They may act arrogant, dismissive, or superior, but underneath that presentation may be a child who feels deeply inadequate. This is called a defensive adaptation. A defensive adaptation is a coping strategy the psyche develops to protect itself from emotional pain. If a child feels repeatedly exposed as failing, they may protect themselves by acting untouchable. If they feel powerless, they may act controlling. If they feel ashamed, they may act superior. If they feel rejected, they may reject first. This is especially common in adolescence because adolescence is already a developmental stage organized around identity, autonomy, peer status, and sensitivity to humiliation. A teenager with ADHD may already feel behind. If they are also living in a family system where their struggles are framed as selfishness, laziness, or disrespect, they may develop a hard outer shell. Parents may then say, "See? They do not care." But the better question is, what had to happen for this child to decide that caring was too vulnerable? This is where parenting requires emotional sophistication. We do not excuse the defensive behavior, but we do understand it. We can say, "I hear you acting like this does not matter, but I know you better than that. I think this is hitting shame. We are still going to deal with the behavior, but I am not going to attack your character." That sentence does several things. It names the defense. It preserves the boundary. It protects the relationship. It keeps the child's identity intact. That is high-level parenting. And let us be honest, it is much easier to say when you have slept, eaten protein, hydrated, and not just stepped barefoot on a Lego while someone is yelling about a missing charger. Regulation is a family resource. This dynamic can also happen in marriages and co-parenting relationships when one adult has ADHD and the other interprets the ADHD behavior as narcissism. A spouse with ADHD may forget important details, interrupt, become defensive, leave tasks unfinished, run late, avoid paperwork, miss emotional cues, or overpromise and underdeliver. The non-ADHD spouse may experience this as selfishness, and sometimes, from the impact side, it is understandable. If you are the partner carrying the calendar, the meals, the school forms, the dentist appointments, the car registration, the insurance, the emotional labor, and every invisible task, it can feel like the ADHD partner does not care. But again, we need to separate impact from intention. Impact matters. If the ADHD partner's inconsistency harms the family, that impact must be addressed. ADHD is an explanation, not a lifetime permission slip. But intention also matters because the intervention differs. If a partner forgets the school meeting because they are entitled and assumes someone else will handle it, that is one thing. If they forget because their working memory, time blindness, and task management systems are impaired, that is another. In both cases, the family needs a solution, but the emotional framing changes. Time blindness is a common ADHD challenge where the person has difficulty sensing the passage of time, estimating how long tasks will take, or organizing behavior around future deadlines. To the non-ADHD spouse, it can look like irresponsibility. To the ADHD brain, the future often does not feel emotionally real until it becomes urgent. Working memory is the ability to hold information in mind long enough to use it. A person with weak working memory may fully intend to do something, then lose the thread. This can look like not caring, but internally it may feel like trying to carry water in a laundry basket. However, here is the important part. Adults with ADHD still need systems. The solution cannot be, This is just how I am, so everyone else needs to adapt. That response can become functionally narcissistic in impact even when the root is ADHD. A healthier response is, my ADHD makes this hard, so I need external systems, reminders, shared calendars, written agreements, alarms, body doubling, visual boards, and accountability structures, so my family does not have to carry my executive function for me. That is the difference between explanation and accountability. ADHD says, this is harder for me. Accountability says, and I am still responsible for building supports. A narcissistic family environment can intensify ADHD symptoms because ADHD brains are highly sensitive to stress, shame, chaos, and emotional unpredictability. When the emotional climate is tense, the ADHD nervous system often becomes more reactive. Stress reduces access to the prefrontal cortex, which is already an area of vulnerability in ADHD. The prefrontal cortex helps with impulse control, planning, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking. When a child is calm, supported, and structured, they have better access to those skills. When they are shamed, threatened, yelled at, mocked, or emotionally cornered, those skills become harder to access. This means the parent's reaction can either help bring the child's brain back online or push it further offline. This is the concept of co-regulation. Co-regulation means one nervous system helps another nervous system return to a calmer, more organized state. Children do not learn regulation through lectures alone. They learn it through repeated experiences of being helped back to calm by a regulated adult. A parent might co-regulate by lowering their voice, naming the feeling, reducing the number of words, offering structure, and staying emotionally steady. For example, you are overwhelmed. We are not going to solve everything right now. First, shoes by the door, then backpack, then we will talk. That is co-regulation. It is not permissive. It is organized. A narcissistic parent may do the opposite. They may escalate, they may shame, they may make the child's dysregulation about themselves. You are embarrassing me. You always do this to me. You make this family miserable. After everything I have done, this is how you act? Now the child is not just dealing with the original task. They are dealing with shame, threat, attachment fear, and emotional overload. That is not co-regulation. That is co-dysregulation. Co-dysregulation happens when one person's nervous system escalates another person's nervous system. In these families, the ADHD child and narcissistic parent can become locked in a co-dysregulating loop. The child's impulsivity triggers the parent's shame. The parent's shame triggers control. The control triggers the child's defiance or collapse. The child's defiance confirms the parent's belief that the child is the problem. And then the healthier parent is left standing in the middle with a metaphorical clipboard, trying to manage the emotional Super Bowl with no referees and no halftime. This is why the system has to change. Not just the child, the system. If you are the parent who sees the complexity, your role matters tremendously. First, you protect the child's identity through accurate language. Instead of saying, you are selfish, say, you had a hard time seeing the impact of your behavior in that moment. Instead of saying, you are lazy, say, task initiation is hard for your brain, so we need a start system. Instead of saying, you do not care, say, I know you care, and we still need to repair what happened. This is not soft parenting. This is precise parenting. Second, you separate the child's brain from the child's character. You can say, your ADHD explains why this is hard. It does not erase your responsibility. We are going to build the skill together. That sentence is gold because it prevents both shame and excuse making. Third, you build external systems. ADHD does not improve through speeches. It improves through structure, repetition, visual cues, environmental design, routines, and accountability that does not rely solely on memory or motivation. Use calendars, checklists, phone alarms, visible bins, written routines, timers, body doubling, and short planning meetings. The ADHD brain often needs the environment to act as the external prefrontal cortex. Fourth, you reduce emotional triangles. If one parent is critical and the child runs to you, resist becoming the child's emotional attorney against the other parent in front of them. You can validate without triangulating. You might say, "I understand that felt really hard. You are allowed to have feelings about it. I am going to help you regulate first, and then we can think about what needs to happen next." Privately, you may need to address the other parent's behavior, but the child should not become the courtroom. Fifth, you model repair. Repair is the process of returning to connection after rupture. All families have ruptures. Healthy families repair. Repair sounds like, "I got too intense earlier. I am sorry. Your behavior needed addressing, but my tone was not helpful." That teaches the child accountability without humiliation. It also teaches them that relationships can survive conflict. Sixth, you create a home culture where boundaries and emotions can coexist. A child needs to learn, "I can be upset and still respectful. I can have ADHD and still be responsible. I can make a mistake and still repair. I can be corrected and still loved." That is the emotional architecture of resilience. Here are some practical scripts you can use when your ADHD child is being labeled as selfish. I want to be careful with the word selfish. What I see is a child whose brain is struggling with impulse control and perspective taking in the moment. We still need accountability, but shame is not going to build the skill. When your child says something hurtful, you were dysregulated and you said something that hurt someone. Both things are true. Your brain was overwhelmed, and repair is still your responsibility. When the other parent escalates, this conversation is becoming more about blame than problem solving. I am going to pause it so we can come back when we are calmer. When your child feels like a bad person, you are not bad. You are having a hard time with regulation and follow-through. That means we need better systems and more practice, not a character attack. When the child tries to avoid accountability, I understand why you felt overwhelmed. I am not arguing with the feeling. I am holding the boundary around the behavior. When a narcissistic parent makes the child's behavior about themselves, I hear that this feels frustrating. I want us to focus on what skill the child needs, not what this means about us as parents. When your child apologizes but keeps repeating the behavior, I appreciate the apology. Now we need a plan. Repair is not only words. Repair means we build a system that makes the pattern less likely next time. These scripts are not magic spells. If only. We would all be walking around with laminated cards and peaceful homes by Tuesday. But scripts matter because they give your regulated brain something to hold on to when the family system gets activated. The way a family interprets ADHD has long-term consequences. A child who grows up hearing, "Your brain works differently, and we will help you build systems," develops a very different identity from a child who hears, "You are selfish, lazy, dramatic, and impossible." A child who learns repair develops relational maturity. A child who is shamed develops hiding. A child who receives structure develops competence. A child who receives contempt develops defensiveness. A child whose nervous system is co-regulated develops self-regulation. A child whose nervous system is repeatedly escalated develops hypervigilance, avoidance, aggression, or collapse. Hypervigilance means the nervous system is constantly scanning for threat. In a home with narcissistic traits and ADHD conflict, a child may become highly tuned to a parent's mood. They may know by the sound of the door, the footsteps, the silence, or the facial expression whether the house is safe. This can look like maturity, but it is often anxiety in a blazer. Avoidance means the child avoids tasks, conversations, emotions, or responsibilities because they associate them with shame or conflict. Avoidance is often misunderstood as laziness. In reality, avoidance is frequently a nervous system strategy to escape emotional threat. Collapse is a shutdown response. A child may stop trying, stop explaining, stop caring, or stop engaging because the system feels unwinnable. This is the child who says, whatever, but underneath that word is grief, shame, and emotional exhaustion. This is why I want parents to become very careful interpreters of behavior. Children borrow our interpretation of them before they develop their own. If we repeatedly define them through their worst moments, they may believe us. But if we define the problem accurately, we give them a path forward. Here is the central teaching of this episode. ADHD and narcissism can look similar on the surface, but they are not the same underneath. ADHD is primarily a disorder of regulation, executive function, attention, motivation, inhibition, and emotional control. Narcissistic traits are primarily organized around image protection, entitlement, control, shame defense, and inconsistent empathy. ADHD may cause a child to miss the impact of their behavior in the moment. Narcissism may cause a person to dismiss the impact because protecting the self matters more. ADHD needs structure, skill building, co-regulation, environmental supports, accountability, and compassion. Narcissistic traits require boundaries, clarity, reduced emotional supply, accountability, and protection from emotional manipulation. When families confuse the two, children can be mislabeled, partners can become resentful, and the entire family system can organize around blame instead of understanding. But when families learn to separate brain-based dysregulation from character-based entitlement, everything changes. The child can be held accountable without being shamed. The parent can set limits without attacking identity. The healthier parent can stop overfunctioning and start leading with clarity. And the family can move from emotional chaos toward a more accurate, compassionate, structured way of functioning. That is the deeper work. It is not permissiveness, because we are not excusing harmful behavior, ignoring impact, or pretending that ADHD means a child, teen, partner, or adult is free from responsibility. Accountability still matters. Repair still matters. Follow-through still matters. The difference is that we are no longer using shame as the delivery system. It is also not blame, because blame keeps the family stuck in a courtroom where everyone is trying to prove who is guilty instead of understanding what pattern keeps repeating. Blame asks, who is the problem? Clarity asks, what is the mechanism? What is the need? What is the pattern? And what skill is missing? It is not denial, because denial minimizes the real impact these behaviors have on siblings, spouses, parents, and the emotional climate of the home. And it is not shame, because shame may create short-term compliance, but it does not build executive function, emotional regulation, empathy, or secure attachment. The real work is clarity. Clarity means we can say, this behavior hurt someone, and we are going to repair it, while also saying, this child is not bad, this brain is struggling. Clarity allows us to hold two truths at the same time. The behavior needs to change, and the person still deserves dignity. That is where families stop cycling between excuse-making and character attacks. That is where the nervous system begins to settle, and that is where growth becomes possible. With growth comes clarity, which is powerful because it gives families a clear map. If you're listening to this and thinking, this is my family, I want you to take a breath. This is complex. You are not wrong for feeling confused by it. ADHD alone can be challenging. Narcissistic traits alone can be deeply destabilizing. When they exist in the same family system, the emotional math gets complicated very quickly, but complicated does not mean hopeless. If you are the parent who sees the pattern, your steadiness matters. Your language matters. Your interpretation matters. Your willingness to say, this is ADHD, not a character flaw, matters. Your willingness to also say, ADHD explains it, but we still need repair, matters. Your ability to resist shame, reduce triangulation, and build structure matters. And if your child has been mislabeled, misunderstood, or repeatedly told they are selfish when they are actually dysregulated, you can begin changing that narrative. You can help them understand their brain without excusing harmful behavior. You can teach them that accountability is not humiliation. You can show them that repair is possible. You can help them build systems that make success more likely. Because the goal is not to raise a child who never struggles. The goal is to raise a child who understands their struggle, has tools for it, takes responsibility for their impact, and still knows they are deeply worthy of love. And in families where narcissistic traits have created shame, blame, or emotional confusion, that kind of parenting becomes more than helpful. It becomes protective. This episode is for educational purposes and to provide support. It's not a substitute for professional mental health evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment. The more we learn to recognize the signs behind the behaviors, the more compassion and support we can offer to our kids, our partners, and ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this episode was helpful, I'd love it if you shared it with a fellow parent, caregiver, or educator who might need it too. You can also subscribe to stay up to date on future episodes and check out additional tools and resources at thepathtopecetherapy.com. Follow me on Instagram at thepathtopecetherapy. If you are in California, I offer virtual sessions if you are not in the Hermosa Beach and South Bay area. You can book online at the Path to Peace Therapy. And as always, take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, peace is possible, and you don't have to do this alone.